During a thunderstorm above Manhattan, a quiet waitress covering an extra shift finds herself face to face with a billionaire known for his arrogance. When a sudden system failure threatens to destroy his billion-dollar deal with French investors, the same woman he dismissed minutes ago steps forward and changes everything. By the end of the night, power, pride, and control will mean something entirely new. Rain lashed against the glass walls of Le Ciel, a rooftop restaurant floating above the glowing maze of Manhattan. Far below, traffic lights shimmered like restless stars, and the city pulsed through the storm, alive, electric, untouchable. Inside, everything gleamed. Crystal glasses caught the light like tiny chandeliers. Silver cutlery lined the tables in perfect precision. Soft jazz hummed beneath the sound of thunder, and between it all moved Tessa Leclerc, quiet, focused, and one shift away from missing her rent. She wasn't supposed to be here tonight. She'd been halfway out the door when the manager called her back. "You speak French, right?" "Good." Mr. Cole's guests are early. It wasn't really a question. It never was. She needed the money, so she nodded and tied her apron tighter, ignoring the rain dripping from her hair. The dining floor was nearly ready. Black tablecloths, tall candles, a skyline view worth more than her student loans. A group of sharply dressed men had already arrived, laughing in polished accents she recognized instantly. They looked like they belonged to another world, a world she served every night but could never step into. Tessa approached with steady confidence, her posture straight, her smile practiced but kind. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Le Ciel. May I take your coats?" They turned to her, their laughter softening. The eldest among them gave a polite nod. "Thank you," he said. "It's rare to be greeted so warmly these days." "Pleasure's mine," she replied. Her voice carried calm, the kind that made even powerful men pause for a second. The manager caught her eye from across the room and mouthed, "Keep them comfortable until he arrives," and then... The elevator chimed. Adrian Cole stepped out. He didn't just walk in. He commanded the room the way thunder claimed the sky. Tall, sharply dressed, a man who wore confidence like armor. Every detail, from his watch to the crisp edge of his suit, spoke of precision, wealth, and authority. Tessa felt the energy shift immediately. Even the waiters straightened when he passed. This was the billionaire, the man behind Cole Dynamics, a name whispered in boardrooms and business news like myth. His gaze swept across the room, cool and assessing. It landed on Tessa speaking with his guests, and for a fleeting second, something unreadable flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe irritation. She offered a polite nod. He didn't return it. Outside, lightning struck across the skyline. Inside, the storm had just entered the room. Tessa had no idea that before the night ended, the same man who barely looked at her would owe her more than he could ever repay. She needed the extra pay for her tuition. She didn't know that tonight would rewrite her life. Adrian Cole moved through the restaurant with the calm precision of a man used to owning every space he entered. The air seemed to tighten around him, as if the storm outside had followed him in, trapped in his stride and the silent command of his gaze. He was late by only 3 minutes, but for Adrian, 3 minutes was an eternity. Time was currency, and control was the interest he collected. Tonight, both mattered more than ever. This dinner wasn't just about good wine and polite laughter. It was about closing a deal worth over $1 billion, with investors flown in from Paris. His empire depended on their trust, and any crack in tonight's performance could cost him everything he'd built. His translator had failed him before. Fumbling phrases, confusing details, once even calling a profit a problem. That mistake had cost him weeks of negotiation. Tonight had to be flawless. The guests rose slightly as he approached. Adrian smiled, a well-rehearsed one, the kind that looked genuine but never quite reached his eyes. "Gentlemen," he greeted smoothly, shaking hands, his tone professional but cool. "I trust you've been well taken care of." They nodded politely, but their attention flickered toward Tessa, the young waitress who had just greeted them moments earlier. She was still nearby, discreetly arranging glasses, but she could feel their eyes on her. One of the investors spoke, gesturing toward her. "Your staff has been most accommodating," he said warmly. "Especially the young lady who welcomed us. She made us feel quite at home." Tessa smiled softly and inclined her head. Adrian followed their gaze, his expression unreadable. His jaw tightened just slightly, the way it did when something unexpected disrupted his sense of order. He forced a polite nod. "I'm glad to hear that," he replied, though his tone was clipped, almost mechanical. Then he turned toward Tessa, lowering his voice. "Thank you. That'll be all for now. It wasn't rude. Just final." The kind of tone that ended conversations before they began. Tessa stepped back, hands folded neatly in front of her. "Of course, sir." She returned to her station by the bar, her calm expression hiding the sting behind his words. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it, as if her presence itself was a disruption to his design. Adrian turned his attention back to the table, his smile back in place. "Let's begin," he said, signaling the start of what he assumed would be a smooth evening. But the storm outside thundered louder, a subtle warning against that assumption, because control, like glass, always looks strongest right before it shatters. Still on a tense call, Adrian sees his guest chatting with a waitress. Control slipping, he ends the call. "That's not your role," he says flatly. The words aren't cruel, just cold. Tessa steps back quietly, but something in her eyes lingers. It isn't what he said, but how he said it. Adrian's phone vibrated against the polished table, its glow lighting the tense angles of his face. He excused himself with a brief nod, stepping a few feet away to take the call, his voice low, sharp, calculated. Words like terms, equity, and final sign-off drifted across the space like shards of glass. At the table, the investors exchanged quiet glances. Tessa noticed the flicker of impatience behind their smiles. They'd been gracious so far, but even the most polite men disliked being left waiting. Sensing the tension, she moved closer, offering a warm smile. "Would you like a refill while Mr. Cole finishes his call?" she asked gently. The eldest investor nodded, smiling back. "Please." "You're very kind." As she poured, one of the men asked where she'd learned to speak French so fluently. She answered modestly, explaining she'd grown up in Montreal and worked her way through college by waitressing. Her calm confidence seemed to soften them further. Laughter began to replace the silence, the air lightening again. Then Adrian ended his call. He turned and froze. His guests were laughing with a waitress. His guests, the ones he'd flown in from another continent to impress. Something in his chest tightened. Not jealousy, not irritation exactly, just the feeling that his control over the moment was slipping through invisible cracks. He walked back, his tone even but distant. "That's not your role," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the air like the sound of the storm outside. "Let my team handle the conversation." The room stilled. Tessa's hands paused on the tray, the faintest tremor in her fingers before she steadied them. Her face remained calm, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course, sir." She stepped back, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. The investors exchanged subtle looks, not of offense, but of quiet surprise. They had seen the shift too. Adrian didn't notice. Or maybe he did, but refused to acknowledge it. He sat down again, the conversation now stilted, mechanical. The warmth from a few minutes ago evaporated like mist. From her corner near the service bar, Tessa caught one of the investors murmuring to another. She couldn't hear every word, but the tone was unmistakable. Doubt. And yet she said nothing. It wasn't her place to correct a billionaire. Still, something in her chest burned. Not anger. Something quieter. Something closer to disappointment. Not in him, but in the way moments like this always unfolded. Adrian straightened his cuffs, unaware that one sentence had already shifted the energy of the entire evening. At the table, the investors murmur softly, their tone polite but distant. Adrian doesn't understand the words, but Tessa does. Their politeness has turned brittle. She says nothing. It's not her place. But the fracture is there now, faint and real. One of them made a light remark, something about confidence needing a touch of humility, and though he said it softly, Tessa understood perfectly. She knew they weren't speaking about the wine or the meal. They were speaking about him. Adrian, unaware, continued to lead the conversation in his polished, efficient way. He didn't notice how often the guests exchanged glances, how their attention wandered. He thought he was steering the ship. He didn't see the slow current pulling it off course. From her place by the bar, Tessa refilled glasses and cleared plates with quiet precision. She moved like air, invisible but essential, catching every flicker of discomfort, every strained pause. When the main course arrived, Adrian gestured toward the skyline behind him. "New York is a storm that never sleeps," he said, trying to ease the mood. "You have to learn how to build stronger towers before you step into it." The investors smiled, but their eyes didn't sparkle. They murmured something about the beauty of old cities, about foundations that last longer than towers. Tessa felt the tension ripple again. Their words weren't harsh, but layered, polite resistance disguised as charm. She said nothing. She simply moved between tables, quietly translating what they didn't say into what Adrian needed to hear, though she knew he never would. Thunder rolled through the glass walls, making the candles flicker. The air smelled faintly of rain and unease. Adrian reached for his tablet to review the presentation, but the screen glitched. A faint flicker, then a static freeze. He frowned, tapping it twice. Nothing. The Wi-Fi must have been hit by the storm. "Strange," he muttered, checking his phone next. No signal. At the same moment, one of the investors tried connecting to their live interpreter back in Paris. The call dropped instantly. The man sighed. "Without our translator, this could be difficult." Adrian straightened, forcing calm. "It's temporary. The network will reset any minute." But the faint concern in his tone betrayed him. The storm outside cracked again, closer, louder. The lights flickered overhead, and the sound system gave a faint pop before fading into silence. Around the room, guests began to whisper. The manager signaled for patience. Adrian rubbed his temple, his jaw tight. He hated chaos, and chaos had just walked in. He turned to the investors, trying to mask his frustration with a strained smile. "We can continue discussing the numbers while we wait," he offered, but they hesitated. Without the translator, the risk of miscommunication loomed too large. One of them shook his head. "We prefer to wait," he said softly. Tessa watched as the power dynamic shifted in real time, the billionaire's composure cracking under the weight of something as small as silence. Adrian's tablet screen went black. He pressed the power button again and again, but it was useless. His phone had no signal either. The investors tried connecting their devices, exchanging uncertain looks. "Without connection," one of them said finally, "we cannot continue. The figures are stored online." Adrian exhaled slowly, fighting the impulse to curse under his breath. "There's a backup," he said, though there wasn't one he could easily access without the system online. His composure cracked, not visibly, but in the subtle tightness around his eyes. Tessa stood by the service station, watching from a respectful distance. She saw his fingers flex restlessly against the edge of the table, his jaw tightening with every failed attempt to regain control. One of the investors leaned toward the others, murmuring in French, assuming Adrian couldn't understand. "He's good, but he depends too much on technology. No instincts." Tessa caught the words like a spark catching dry wood. She felt them burn in her chest, though they weren't aimed at her. She glanced at Adrian. He was pretending not to notice, but she saw the flicker in his expression, the slight drop of his gaze. He didn't know the full sentence, but he understood enough to feel the sting. Trying to bridge the awkward pause, Adrian forced a smile. "Gentlemen," he began carefully, "perhaps we can discuss the strategic direction verbally until the system resets." He spoke slowly, trying to recall bits of French he'd once learned for business trips years ago. But his words were broken, his phrasing off. The investors' polite smiles strained with every sentence. "Your efforts are admirable," one said gently, "but the nuances are difficult to follow." Adrian nodded stiffly, a flicker of frustration beneath his calm. He hated this, being at the mercy of circumstance, dependent on others. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by another rumble that seemed to shake the building itself. One of the waiters rushed over to whisper something about the power grid being unstable. Adrian pressed his fingers to his temple, eyes closing briefly. "Not tonight," he muttered to himself. "Not tonight," Tessa hesitated. Her instincts told her to stay silent. This wasn't her problem. But something inside her rebelled against that thought. She'd watched him shrink under the pressure, a man used to controlling storms now caught in one. From the far end of the table, one of the investors sighed, checking his watch. "We may have to postpone," he said. "Without interpretation, it's too great a risk to proceed." Adrian looked up sharply. "No, we can fix this." But he didn't know how. His empire, his billion-dollar image of control, now trembled under the quiet weight of failure. In the corner, Tessa took a breath. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when it came, was calm but sure. "If I may," she said softly. All heads turned toward her. "I can help translate." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Even the sound of the rain seemed to pause. Adrian's eyes met hers across the table, a clash of control and calm. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between disbelief and pride that refused to show itself. One of the investors leaned forward. "You speak French?" he asked, hopeful. "Yes," she replied. Fluently, he smiled, relief softening his features. "Then please, we would be honored." Tessa glanced at Adrian, silently asking for permission. He hesitated only a second, then gave a small nod. Not out of trust, but necessity. She moved closer to the table, her hands folded in front of her, voice steady as she began translating the conversation. Not with mechanical precision like an interpreter, but with the kind of intuition that came from truly listening. Her tone shifted gently between languages, warm, fluid, alive. Every nuance, every expression carried the exact weight of the original meaning. Within minutes, the tension began to fade. The investors leaned in again, smiling, laughing softly. The storm outside still raged, but inside, it felt as though a window had opened. Adrian watched in silence. He had spent his entire career mastering control, commanding rooms, silencing chaos, dictating every variable. Yet here was a waitress, standing in the dim light, restoring what he couldn't, without authority, without power, and only presence. At one point, one of the investors made a complicated joke about market volatility and the unpredictability of people. Adrian would have missed it entirely. But Tessa translated it with a subtle grace that kept the humor intact. The table erupted in laughter. Even Adrian smiled, caught off guard by how natural it sounded. She didn't just bridge a language. She bridged distance between arrogance and understanding, between what was said and what was meant. When she finished translating a particularly complex discussion about partnership terms, one of the investors looked at her with quiet admiration. "You have a gift," he said. "You make words sound like trust." Tessa smiled politely, lowering her eyes. "Thank you, sir. That's kind of you." Adrian felt something shift inside him. It wasn't attraction. It wasn't embarrassment. It was perspective. He had spent the entire evening believing power came from control. But now, watching her, steady, composed, unshaken by the weight of the room, he realized true power might come from grace instead. The storm began to ease. Lightning still flickered beyond the glass, but the thunder had softened, almost respectful now. The investor's confidence returned. The conversation flowed freely again, smooth, balanced, alive, and through it all, Tessa's voice carried them, the quiet heartbeat of a meeting that was supposed to fall apart. Adrian sat back, eyes on her, wondering how he'd ever missed her strength before. Tessa stood near the head of the table, translating fluidly, her expression calm yet focused. She didn't command attention. She earned it without even trying. Her words flowed like water smoothing the edges of stone, gentle, effortless, and precise. Every so often, Adrian caught himself watching her instead of listening to the discussion. He wasn't used to this, sitting still, not controlling, not directing. But he realized that, for the first time that night, everything was moving perfectly without him forcing it. He folded his hands, exhaling slowly. For years, he'd believed leadership was about dominance, about speaking the loudest in the room, about knowing more, about never appearing uncertain. But as he watched Tessa, he saw something entirely different. She didn't need authority to be respected. Her power came from understanding, from empathy, patience, and precision. At one point, one of the investors told a story about the early days of his company, a story of failure, perseverance, and rebuilding. As Tessa translated, she didn't just repeat the words. She captured the feeling, the rhythm, the pauses that gave them meaning. The table fell silent, listening as if hearing the man's heart through her voice. When she finished, the investor nodded gratefully. "You understand people," he said to her. "That's rarer than understanding business." Adrian's chest tightened at those words. Not out of jealousy, but humility. He'd built an empire on numbers, contracts, and negotiation. But none of that had reached these men the way a single waitress just had. She wasn't trying to impress them. She was simply being herself. When dessert was served, one of the guests raised a toast. To understanding, the one thing every great partnership is built upon. Glasses clinked. The moment felt sincere. Adrian lifted his own glass, his eyes flicking toward Tessa. She smiled, not at him, but at the collective peace in the room. Yet even that small smile felt like an answer to something unspoken. As the dinner drew to a close, the investors began discussing final terms again. The Wi-Fi finally reconnected, screens coming back to life, but no one rushed to reopen the presentation. The conversation had already accomplished what technology couldn't. Adrian leaned back in his chair, the weight in his shoulders finally easing. The storm had broken both outside and within him. He looked at Tessa, a woman he had dismissed an hour ago, and realized he was witnessing something he'd spent years chasing but never grasping. Quiet mastery. It wasn't in power, it was in presence. The meeting continued in calm efficiency until the final handshake, when one of the investors turned to Tessa and said, "You should be the one teaching communication, not serving tables." A faint blush touched her cheeks. "Maybe one day," she said. Adrian's eyes lingered on her, unreadable. He didn't speak, not yet, but inside something had already shifted permanently. The investors thanked Tessa first, praising her calm and clarity. Adrian said little, only watched her, seeing for the first time what grace under pressure truly looked like. When the doors closed behind them, the restaurant fell quiet, except for the soft hum of the city outside. He walked toward her. "I owe you an apology," he said. She met his eyes calmly. "You don't. Languages change. Respect shouldn't." The words landed deeper than any reprimand could. The next morning, sunlight spilled through her small apartment window. On her table lay an envelope embossed with Hale Enterprises. Inside, a letter. "We invite you to join our communications and liaison team for the upcoming European summit." Her hands trembled. She reread the words, heart pounding. Across the city, Adrian opened an email from the investors. "Your bilingual staff ensured clarity and professionalism. We look forward to future partnership." He typed a reply to HR. "Promote Tessa Leclerc to client relations next quarter." "She's earned it." That evening, Tessa returned for her last shift. The manager called out, "Leclerc, early again?" She smiled softly, just on time for a new beginning. Before leaving, she stood by the window where the storm had once raged. The city gleamed, clear, alive, endless. Some victories aren't loud. They don't make headlines. They happen in silence, when kindness replaces pride and grace becomes power.